Okay, good morning everybody. I'll just briefly stand up so that you can all see me. A very, very warm welcome to this very special day, Learn Behind the Labels. And for those of you who've come long distances, a very special welcome. And for those of you who don't know me, though I think many of you do, my name's Maureen Kendler. And the first thing I want to do is to just say a huge thank you to David for the fantastic work, the vision that he had in putting this day together, and the enormous amount of work that he did. And I think we're very blessed and very proud to have somebody like David just quietly getting on with things and making things happen. So a big thank you from all of us. I know I look like I don't have an enormous international panel to introduce you, and that's because they are, as we speak, winging their way this way. But we are going to begin the day. The day, as I'm sure you know, has two parts. So there's now until 3 o'clock, and then the next session begins at 4. And if you haven't paid and you want to stay, please do. That's absolutely fine. And also there is a session tomorrow evening at Norris Lee Shul, which we'll speak about later on in the day. But for the moment, we're going to start straight away with our first speaker. And the idea of Learn Behind the Labels, I think we all feel very restricted by the idea of having labels stuck on us to say who we are and what we stand for, and therefore we cannot possibly look beyond that label. I think that is a very, very worrying and very negative trend in our community. I don't think that the problem that we have, perhaps, in our community at the moment is that we are not talking. I think we're doing a great deal of talking. I think we're doing very little listening. And I think the talking has become a kind of talking at and talking to and not talking with. So I'm hoping today will be a little bit different. And I'm really, really delighted and honoured to introduce our first speaker, and that's Rabbi Dr Sam Lebens. Many of you will know him. He's got a PhD in logic and metaphysics from Birkbeck College and is now a postdoctoral research fellow at the Center of Philosophy of Religion at Rutgers University in New Jersey. He's published academic papers on a wide array of issues, from the work of Bertrand Russell to Hasidic philosophy, and, knowing Sam as I do, stopping at all stations in between those two things. He spent 6 years in Israeli yeshivot. He has smicha from Rav Zalman Nehemiah Goldberg. He blogs for Haaretz. And if anybody's been taught by Sam before, he needs no introduction as one of the really, really special and gifted minds of our generation. So I'm really, really delighted.
You went over the top then. You were doing really well until then, but that was just, yeah.
No, I'm not taking that back, because actually I don't throw that one out lightly, and I do say it about Sam because I really do mean it. So without any further ado, Sam.
Thank you. And thank you, Maureen. It's really an honour to be introduced by Maureen, who is a mentor to me and to many educators that come through Britain. We wouldn't be who we are without Maureen. So, okay, so this talk that I want to give today is pretty difficult. I was told, my mother-in-law told me that some of her friends heard me speak at Limud, and their comment was this: they said, "We saw your son-in-law speak. It was really great. We just didn't understand a word." and I had to reflect on that for a bit, because I don't know if I could enjoy something if I didn't understand. I don't know what was it that they were enjoying? I don't know. But if you don't understand a word of this, don't worry, because I'm not sure that I do either, this particular talk. So I think I actually have time to say all the things I want to say, so I won't do too much by way of preamble. But this, of all the sessions that I've prepared to give at this, in terms of philosophy, so going to a conference in Missouri on the nature of faith, and this is what I want to present there. So if this isn't a complete train wreck, then I might use it there. Let me know what you think. Okay, so I'll throw myself right in. You have the title there. Most of you aren't going to be able to read what's on the screen. It's going to be too small and fuzzy, but it will just help me, and then I'll read it out for people. So, okay. The title, as you know, what do we believe that God is doing on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and what should we make believe? Okay, so this is not great. Oh, there we go. 1 second. That's fine. So we say in the prayers on Rosh Hashanah in Avinu Malkeinu. Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King, is a prayer attributed to Rabbi Akiva. We only know that he wrote a couple of stanzas of it. It seems to be a prayer that evolved over many generations, but in the form in which we have it, it has these stanzas in that I'll read for you. We say, Avinu Malkeinu katvenu b'sefer chaim tovim. Our Father, our King, write us into the book of good life. And following the pattern, we ask to be written into the book of redemption and salvation. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. Okay. We ask to be written into the book of income and sustenance. I'm particularly looking forward to being inscribed into that one. I think my name was a bit fuzzily written into it last year. The book of merits and the book of forgiveness and pardon. Okay. So we have this image right away of God sitting up there on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and in the 10 days when we say these stanzas. Is that the plural of stanzas, or is it stanzai? Stanzas. Okay, good. Right. So the image that this evokes is God sitting there in front of lots of books. It's clearly kind of has its feet in the following source, the famous source from Masechet Rosh Hashanah, that talks about 3 books being opened before God on Rosh Hashanah. So it seems like by the time that Avinu Malkeinu was written, his library had become more extensive, because there are more than 3 books here. There are only 3 books here. The 3 books opened up on Rosh Hashanah. One's for the completely evil, one for the completely righteous, and one for those who are in between, the Beinonim. So the completely righteous are immediately written and sealed into the book of life on Rosh Hashanah. Please God, that should be the case for all of us. The completely wicked, God forbid, are immediately written and sealed into the book of death. But most of us, let's face it, are somewhere in between. And the case of those who are in between is suspended from Rosh Hashanah until Yom Kippur. The implication is they're actually written into this 3rd book. There's the 3rd book for kind of undecideds. That's what you're written into on Rosh Hashanah. And if after the 10 days of Teshuvah you merit it, then you'll get written, your name will be transferred from that intermediate book into the book of life. And God forbid, if we don't merit it, then we will be written into the book of death. And to believe this is emotionally powerful. To stand before Hashem on Rosh Hashanah, truly believing that your life hangs in the balance in that way, is clearly one of the most powerful moments of Jewish life. In Unatane Tokef, the central prayer of one of the central prayers of the days of awe, we have this phrase, Barosh Hashanah Yekatevun, Uviyom Tzom Kippur Yechatemun. On the day of Rosh Hashanah we will be written, and on the day of Yom Kippur we will be sealed. And the words, I think, are this is just a translation of some of that prayer. I think some of the most moving words in Jewish liturgy, if you're really engaging with this belief. All mankind will pass before you like a flock of sheep, like a shepherd pasturing his flock, making sheep pass under his staff. So shall you cause to pass, count, calculate, and consider the souls of all of the living. And to skip a bit, we'll say, on Rosh Hashanah it will be written, on Yom Kippur it will be sealed. How many will pass away? How many will be created? Who will live? Who will die? Who will die at his predestined time? Who before his time? Who by water? Who by fire? Who by sword? Who by beast? Skipping a bit, who will rest and who will wander? Who will live in harmony and who will be harried? Who will enjoy tranquility and who will suffer? This is all being decided on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And There's no doubt about it that these are very, very powerful images. Now, what I want you to do is imagine this. This is a woman I'm calling Sarah. I don't really know who she is. She probably wouldn't appreciate having her photos shared in this way, but I found her on Google Images, and her face is covered, so you know it does. I don't feel it's like a violation of her privacy, but her name is. I'm calling her Sarah, and you meet Sarah on a bus. You don't know anything about her, but you get talking to her, and you ask her where she's going, and she says, "I'm going to visit my family. It's Rosh Hashona. I'm going to visit my family for Rosh Hashona." So you get talking to her and you say, well, you know, what is Rosh Hashona? Why is it significant to you? And she comes out with the following sentence. She says, I believe that God judges us on Rosh Hashona, writing us into books that we deserve to be written into, and that on Yom Kippur, our fate for the year will be sealed. She utters that sentence in order to explain to you, speaking to on the bus, why it is this day so significant to her. And surely, it's that belief, I believe that God judges us on Rosh Hashanah, writing us into the various books, that makes Rosh Hashanah such a powerful day for her. That's why she cries when she says that prayer, Unatai Tokef, because of this belief. The question I want to think through with you is, you don't know Sarah at all. You don't know what she knows, you don't know what she doesn't know, you don't know how clever she is, you don't know anything about her, how literate she is. How are you supposed to interpret this belief, this statement of hers? I believe that God judges us on Rosh Hashanah. So, first of all, I think we probably assume that she doesn't really believe that God has books and a quill and a pen. First of all, you're not allowed to write on Rosh Hashanah, right? So there's clearly a metaphor embedded in her own statement, okay? So we need to cash that out. And I think that what we'd probably arrive at a first guess is what I'm calling RH1, like my first interpretation of this statement about Rosh Hashanah. Something like this. Sarah believes that God judges her on Rosh Hashanah, or begins a judicial process that ends on Yom Kippur, and that she has a very high stake in the outcome of that judgment. I'm just trying to cash out. She talks as if God's writing names into books. I don't think we think that that's what she believes. So being charitable to her, this is how we interpret her. She means something like she believes that God judges her on Rosh Hashanah and it's important. Fine. There's a debate in Jewish theology. There's a debate in theology at large about the relationship between God and time. Okay? And the two main camps are the temporalists and the atemporalists. So the temporalists would say that God is in time just like you and me. That means God has a past, he has memories of the past, he has a present, he's living in the present with us, and he's looking forward to a future. He doesn't get older in the way that we get older, because when we get older, unfortunately, our capacities and our bodies and all of these other things seem to run away from us. God doesn't age, but time passes for him. And even if he knows what's going to happen in the future hasn't happened for him yet. He's waiting to see the future unfold, even if he knows exactly how it's going to unfold. That's the temporalist view. The atemporalist view is probably the more popular one in Jewish thought. The atemporalist view is to say it's almost heretical to think that God is a prisoner of time. God, as a friend of mine wrote a paper called Is God the Prisoner of the Oldest Dimension? Right? Is God a prisoner of time? What that means is, does God live in time like you and me? Does he have a past? Does he have a present? Does he have a future? And the atemporalist says no. God lives somehow outside of time. This is supposed to help with all sorts of problems. When we say, God knew yesterday what you're going to do tomorrow, that generates this famous problem of free will in the face of God's foreknowledge. Because if God already knew yesterday what you're going to do tomorrow, then it seems like you can't change what you're going to do tomorrow, because God already knew yesterday what it was that you were going to do. And one of the ways out of this is atemporalism. You say, no, you've somehow spoken incorrectly when you say God did something yesterday, God knew yesterday what you're going to be doing tomorrow, because God's outside of time. That's atemporalism. Problem with atemporalism is that it's inconsistent with what Sarah's said. Okay, Sarah has said that she believes that God judges her on Rosh Hashana. And I imagine, I should have done a straw poll beforehand. How many of the people in this room, and don't be embarrassed to be on one side of the fence or the other, how many people in this room, especially before I started talking, would have said that you believe that God judges you on Rosh Hashana? Go on, put your hands up if you believe that. That's okay. Don't be embarrassed. You know, this is yeah, and every day. Okay, and every day. So that's an interesting thing. Like, we call Rosh Hashanah Yom Adin, and the Day of Judgment. And part of why it's so powerful for us is that we believe God's judging us on it. But there are these two tensions. One tension is we also believe God's judging us every day. So how does Rosh Hashanah become special? What makes Rosh Hashanah the Day of Judgment? The other problem is it's incompatible with this view I called atemporalism. Atemporalism is the view that God isn't in time. You talk infelicitously when you say that God does anything on Rosh Hashanah. Because God isn't having Rosh Hashanah like we are. It wasn't like, oh, yesterday was Tuesday and today's Rosh Hashanah. He's not experiencing the calendar in the way that we are. The atemporalists like to talk about God as if he's living in what they call an eternal present. I don't exactly know what that means, but he doesn't have the days of the calendar like we have. So you don't know anything about Sarah. You're on the bus with her. She said, I believe that God judges us on Rosh Hashanah, writing us into the books that we deserve to be written into, and not on Yom Kippur. Our fate for the year will be sealed. And we thought the most charitable interpretation of that was this heavily temporalist reading. What I mean by that is we attribute to her the belief, because of what she said, that God judges her on Rosh Hashanah. But of course, as I said, that's incompatible with atemporalism. So we could figure out, well, what would an atemporalist mean? Maimonides, for example, was an atemporalist. So what would he have meant by calling Rosh Hashanah the Day of Judgment? What might an atemporalist mean by believing that God judges you on Rosh Hashanah? So this is really hard. And this is one of the reasons why in recent time in philosophical theology, temporalism has become a much more popular view, especially in Christian theology, and a group of theologians called open theologians. Because it's really hard to square atemporalism with talk about God acting at a certain time. In the year so-and-so, God freed us from Egypt. No, he didn't. He's not in time. Right? On day one, God created light. No, he didn't. He's not in time. Right? Any talk about God that seems to place him at some point in a temporal order is not allowed by the atemporalist. So it's a struggle. But they'll say something like this. So yesterday we learned chapters 5 and 6 of Pirkei Avot. And in one of those chapters, I can't remember which one, there's this famous Mishnah about the 10 things that were created before the 6 days finished. And it's just on the Friday, just before the first Shabbat. And it's a strange list of things, like the mouth of a donkey without the donkey. So there's a number of orifices that were created on that day. So the hole that swallowed Korach, right, was created on that day, and this bodiless donkey's mouth. What Maimonides says about this in his Peirush to that Mishnah is that really what's going on here and I won't bore you with the details of how you square this with the words of the Mishnah, but what's going on here is the rabbis of the Mishnah are explaining to you, believe it or not, that there's no such thing as a miracle that wasn't actually written into the laws of nature right from the start. So it wasn't that when Korach was being a naughty boy, God decided to make a miracle and the earth would swallow him up. No, all the way at the beginning of time, God wrote into the laws of nature that in very unique situations, maybe when naughty people are speaking in certain places, grounds would open and swallow people up. It's a law of nature. So you're standing there at the Red Sea, and the sea splits. It's not right to say, strictly speaking, that God is now splitting the sea. Rather, he wrote into the laws of nature that seas would split at certain times, very rarely, and that's what happened. In fact, there was no time at which God wrote the laws of nature, because God isn't in time. Rather, he somehow timelessly writes them in his timeless kind of a way. But on that day, when we were on that beach and the sea split, one of the timeless aspects of God became manifest to us. We didn't know until that time that it was written into the laws of nature timelessly that such a thing would happen in such a circumstance. So, you're going to have to say something like this if you want to make Sarah an atemporalist. And it's got some funky metaphysics in it. Sarah believes that God atemporally judges her in some timeless kind of a way, and that on Rosh Hashona, this aspect of God, which is always there because God isn't in time, is more accessible and perhaps more easy for us to entreaty, and that through our actions on that day and on the following days that lead up to Yom Kippur, we're just more likely to be efficacious in receiving clemency because of the temporary accessibility of the relevant timeless aspects of God. So God is somehow always judging, but there's something about Rosh Hashona that makes that more manifest to us and maybe more easy to entreaty. It's a bit weird why it should be that one of the calendar days has this power to kind of open a window to some part of God that we can't normally access. But it seems to me that's the best way you're going to be able to square atemporalism with the belief that Rosh Hashanah is somehow specially a day of judgment. Problem is, you're sitting on the bus with Sarah and you don't know anything about her. You probably assume that she hasn't taken a course in the metaphysics of time, though, because how many people have? So it's not really a very likely interpretation of what she really meant to communicate, because this thing here, this really long, unwieldy interpretation of her statement, is something you probably couldn't write unless you were either on LSD or had taken a course in metaphysics. So it's just an unlikely interpretation of what she said. It's probably not what she meant. Problem with the first interpretation is that it's incompatible with atemporalism. And let me ask you a question. Having had the debate, atemporalism, God is in time, and atemporalism, God is outside of time, and temporalism, God is in time, which do you naturally gravitate to? Put your hands up if you think that God isn't in time, he's beyond time. That seems to be the majority opinion in Jewish thought and in this room. But the majority opinion in this room was also that God judges us on Rosh Hashanah. Right? So you're all being inconsistent. Right? Or, if you're not being inconsistent, we've got some work to do. Maybe you all believed this. But I doubt that you all came into the room believing this because, like I said, most of you are not on LSD and most of you haven't taken a course in metaphysics of time, so it's unlikely that most of you at least had fully formulated in your head that view. So what's going on? This, I think, is a puzzle, okay? And I'm going to put the puzzle like this. We've got a few options. Remember, Sarah said something. She said she believes that God writes names into books on Rosh Hashanah. And we had two readings. The temporalist reading and the atemporalist reading of what she said. So the option one, the temporalist reading is the right interpretation. You, sitting there on the bus, listening to what she said, the only thing you have a right to infer is the temporalist interpretation. And she says she believes that God judges her on Rosh Hashanah. That's what she means. God judges her on Rosh Hashanah. So the temporalist reading is the right one. But if Sarah isn't a temporalist, like most of you in the room, and we can assume Sarah probably is too, she's either confused or what she said was a bit misleading. Because when she said she believes that God judges her on Rosh Hashanah, that led us to think that she was a temporalist, and she's not, so she misled us. She should have said more. She should have explained better. She misled us. Okay. Option two is that the temporalist reading is the right interpretation. Oh, no, that's supposed to be atemporalist, sorry. The atemporalist reading, the long, really difficult one, is the right interpretation, even if Sarah can't understand it. There are some people, they call this a theory of semantic blindness. Sometimes we say things which are more complicated than even we understand. Right? So Sarah, she is an atemporalist like most of you are in the room. She also believes that God judges her on Rosh Hashana like most of you do in the room. What she really means is that God timelessly judges us, but that Rosh Hashana has some power to make manifest some timeless aspect of God that only becomes manifest on that day. She doesn't realise that that's what she means. She's probably not capable of even formulating that belief without some tutoring in the relevant concepts, but that is what she believes. I find that ugly, because I don't think people are that semantically blind. And the third option is that her statement was ambiguous. You can't actually know what she means until you ask her more. So the reason I think this is a puzzle is I don't want to say that she's being misleading. I don't want to say that she's necessarily confused or that everyone in this room who raised their hands twice is confused. So I don't like option 1. I don't like option 2 because I think we can sometimes not understand sometimes we can misunderstand ourselves, right? We think one thing when we really think another thing. I think it's not possible for us to believe things that we can't understand, though. Like, I don't think I could have a player in the game of particle physics, because I just don't understand any particle physics. I don't think I can have a belief about particle physics. I just don't know anything about it. And to say, oh no, you do have a belief, it's just you don't understand what it is you believe, I think that's really weird. So it's a puzzle. I also don't think that what she said was ambiguous. She believes that God judges her on Rosh Hashanah. That doesn't strike me as an ambiguous thing to say. I intuitively, if we were having this conversation and I wasn't being a philosopher, I'd say, I understand what you mean. Okay, great. So, what I'm going to do when I'm in Missouri is try and give these non-Jewish philosophers an example that might make more sense to them. Okay, so I want to envisage a conversation between Galileo, just after Galileo discovered his theory of heliocentricity, that the sun is at the centre of the solar system, the earth goes around the sun. He goes down to the marketplace to buy some cod from his fishmonger, and he says to him, "Oh gosh, Bob, you must have been up early this morning. I saw you setting your stall up as the sun rose above the horizon." Now, Bob doesn't know that Galileo is a scientist. Bob has adopted from his school days and what everyone else thought, the view that the Earth is at the centre of the solar system and that the sun goes around the Earth. And what Galileo said, "I saw you setting up at the stall as the sun rose above the horizon," taken literally, makes it look like Galileo believes that the sun moves, because the sun is the active astronomical figure in this phrase, right? So it seems like Galileo's being really misleading, because he's going to end up giving... Galileo had a friend called Castelli, who was a mathematician and a scientist. Imagine that Castelli, little known historical fact that I've just made up now, was also a fishmonger who had a stall at the marketplace. Had Galileo been saying this to Castelli, it would have been a completely different kettle of fish. Right. Okay, I'm going to use that one in Missouri now. I hadn't thought about that, but okay. So the reason it would have been a different kettle of fish is for the following reasons. Galileo subscribes to heliocentricity, right? Moreover, Castelli knows, unlike the fishmonger, Bob, Castelli knows that Galileo subscribes to heliocentricity. Moreover, Galileo knows that Castelli knows that Galileo subscribes to heliocentricity. And we can go on and on. Castelli knows that Galileo knows that Castelli knows that Galileo subscribes to it, and so on. What we say is Galileo's belief in heliocentricity would have been part of the common background of the conversation between Galileo and Castelli. So had Galileo said, "I saw you setting your stall up as the sun rose above the horizon," had he said it to Castelli, Castelli would have said this. He would have interpreted it naturally as Galileo can't mean that. Galileo believes in heliocentricity. Must mean that Galileo believes that his interlocutor, i.e. me, got up early this morning, and Galileo believes that he saw me setting up my stall, at the time at which the sun appears to be rising over the horizon, given the motion of the earth. That's what Galileo believes. Because I know that, even if I'm not, I know that Galileo subscribes to heliocentricity. That's what Castelli would have automatically thought Galileo was saying, because of the common background of their conversation. But Bob, poor old Bob, he hasn't a clue. He doesn't even know that Galileo is a scientist. So Bob is naturally going to interpret Galileo as to be saying this. Galileo believes that I got up early this morning, and he believes that he saw me setting my stall up at the same time as he saw the sun actually rise over the earth. So we have a similar problem here, because Galileo said something to Bob whose natural interpretation was the geocentric reading. That in that conversation with Bob, where Bob doesn't know that Galileo is a scientist, and Galileo knows that Bob doesn't know that Galileo is a scientist, in that conversation, the right reading of what Galileo said was the geocentric reading. So either Galileo is being misleading, or perhaps he's actually confused himself. When he writes science books, he talks as if the sun's at the centre of the solar system and it's motionless. But when he talks, he keeps going back into belief. He's just a bit confused. Well, I don't think that Galileo was confused, and I also don't think that had he said this to Bob, he would have been misleading, or at least not in some sort of egregious way. There's a book out there by a really nice American philosopher who's based in England, I think I want to say Sussex, called Jennifer Sewell. It's a book on the lying, misleading distinction. She basically thinks that misleading people is basically never different to lying. Think Bill Clinton. I didn't have sexual relations with that woman. Oh, you call that a sexual relation? Oh, I didn't realise. No, you lied, right? No, I just misled because I had a no, that's lying, right? For Jennifer Sewell, misleading people is just as bad as lying. I certainly don't think that if Galileo was being misleading in this conversation, he was doing anything wrong, right? It doesn't seem like he committed some sort of ethical misstep. So the second option is the heliocentric reading is the right interpretation. When you say that the sun rises above the horizon, what you really mean is that the sun appears to rise over the horizon given the motion of the earth. And even before Galileo formed his theory of heliocentricity, and even Bob, when he says that the sun rises, this is what they really mean. They just don't know that's what they really mean. Sunrise really means earth move. That's what it really means. And people just didn't know that, but that's always what it really meant. I find that highly implausible. Okay, so option 2 isn't nice either. And option 3 is that Galileo said something deeply ambiguous. I don't think, when Galileo said, oh, I saw you wake up early this morning as the sun rose above the... I don't think he said something deeply ambiguous. What are we to do? How much time do I have left? Like 3 hours?
Yeah.
Yeah? When did I start?
You're okay for about another 20 minutes.
Brilliant. Okay, good. So what we need to do is I need to describe to you just briefly some things from the philosophy of language and linguistics. Primarily I need to discuss with you the difference between semantics and pragmatics, okay? So semantics is, formal semantics is the attempt to explain a skill that all of you as English speakers have. The skill is that if you know the meaning of English words, then when you are confronted with a sentence, perhaps even a sentence you've never heard before, you just know what it means. Because you know the meanings of the words, and you know how to put the meanings of words together to come up with the meanings of sentences, even sentences you've never heard before. It's called generative semantics, right? When you use Google Translate and you put a sentence of English in, and it comes out with a sentence of French, the reason it's able to do that is because formal semanticians have tried to give a theory of how meanings arise from the combinations of words, and then they can translate from one language to another. The reason why Google Translate is terrible is because we're not all that good at it yet, but we're getting better. Okay, and certainly in artificial intelligence, it's a really important thing to be able to give a formal account of how we're able to generate meanings from sentences. it's not enough for your computer just to have read a dictionary. It needs to know how to put words together to create meanings of sentences. So, for instance, you have this sentence, "You're standing on my toe." Formal semantics will first of all look at the syntax of the phrase and draw a funky chart and show you how the different parts of the sentence are constructed from one another. And then it does this really complicated mathematical stuff involving set theory and whatever, and you end up with a theorem of your theory that will say, "You're standing on my toe is true if and only if the referent of you is standing on a toe of the speaker." But when somebody says you're standing on my toe, they really mean, get off my foot! Right? It's true that the semantics of the statement, "you're standing on my toe," needs to deliver for you the meaning, "you are standing on my toe." That's what the sentence means. But that's not what I mean. I mean, get off my foot. So pragmatics, as opposed to semantics, is the study of how do we figure out what people really mean when what they say is very rarely exactly what they mean. When I say it's cold in here, the semantics of that statement means something like the temperature is low relative to some scale. But pragmatically, I'll often mean something like, could you please turn the heating on, or something like that. How do we work that stuff out? That study's called pragmatics. The study of pragmatics will often try to arrive at its insights through a deeper appreciation of why we converse with one another. What's the point of conversations? So Craig Roberts, a linguist from Iowa State, talks about the primary goal of discourse is communal inquiry. We're trying to convey information or discover collectively information about the world. And she utilizes a metaphor, an analogy that's very common in the literature, an analogy with games. A conversation has a goal. There might be multiple goals. We might even in the midst of the conversation have to negotiate what the goals of our joint conversation are, but there are goals to be discovered. There are rules to the conversation. There are certain moves which are impermissible. We'll talk about that a little bit more. And there are moves you can make. There are strategies. Okay, we want to talk about X. What would be the most productive way of talking about X? What questions should we ask first? What things should we clear out of the way first? A strategy to the conversation. And we assume that everyone in the conversation is being rational. Because if you don't assume that, you're not going to be able to construct a theory, right? Because if we're not being rational, then anything goes, right? And we do think that our patterns of conversation are predictable. If they're not predictable, then it wouldn't be possible for us to understand one another, at least as much as we do. And Robert Stolnaker has developed a really sophisticated theory about how every conversation operates against the backdrop of what he calls a common ground, which is the stuff that all of the speakers believe that all of the other speakers believe. Remember that stuff about Galileo and Castelli. Galileo knows that Castelli knows that Galileo knows that Castelli knows that Galileo knows that Castelli knows that Galileo believes in heliocentricity. That's part of the background of the belief, the stuff that we all know that each other is sharing. That's the common ground. Okay, and here are the rules of conversation that most people in pragmatics think are really important. They come from a guy called Grice, who's basically the founder of contemporary pragmatics. He says there are certain rules. First of all, there's this cooperative principle. We assume, until we have reason to believe otherwise, we assume that the people we're talking to are cooperating with us. I say, where's the I assume that the person I'm talking to is going to try and help me, and that whatever he's saying is going to try and help me. We assume that. We assume that people keep these rules of quality, which is, do not say what you believe to be false. So if you told me something, I'm going to assume that you believe it, because it's one of the rules of conversation. Don't say what you don't believe. So if you said something, I'm going to assume you believe it. Another one is, don't say, there's no way I'm going to finish, is there? Okay. Don't say that for which you lack sufficient evidence. There's rules of quantity. Make your contribution as informative as required. I'm writing an envelope to my friend Bill. And I say, do you know where Bill lives? And you say, yes, somewhere in the south of France. Well, that wasn't useful, right? I'm writing, that's not the postal service, obviously in that context, more is required. But also, don't be too informative. What's your middle name? Well, it's a long story, because my parents were really grateful to a gynecologist called Roger. And even though Roger isn't a name they really loved, they thought that it would be nice to call... No, if your middle name is Roger, the answer to what's your middle name is Roger. Don't be too informative. Even if what you say is true, you're just saying too much. Be relevant. And there are rules of manner. Be as brief as you can, be orderly, try to be unambiguous, try to avoid obscurity. And it's really interesting, we abuse these rules sometimes on purpose in order to communicate more efficaciously. For example, Paul Grice was asked to write a reference for a philosopher who had studied under him. Is he a good philosopher? Paul Grice wrote a letter that said, to whom it may concern, John has wonderful handwriting and is very punctual. So you read that reference and you say, well, I have to assume the cooperative principle. Grice is cooperating with me, but what he said wasn't relevant. So either he's not cooperating or he's exploiting the rule of be relevant in order to send me like a coded message, which is that this guy's a really bad philosopher, right? Or for instance, when I say it's cold in here, that seems to violate various rules of the cooperative principle because I don't seem to have said enough. Well, what do you really mean? Like, why was that an informative statement? Why was that a useful statement? Oh, you must mean something else. Oh, you think I know where the heater is, don't you? That's from the common background, right? Because I own the house and you're just my guest. Oh, you want me to turn the heating on? Okay, so sometimes we exploit violations of these rules in order to communicate in various ways. Okay, so now I think we can start to help answer why Galileo wasn't being terribly misleading. Conversations are shaped, in part, by the questions and assertions that are made in the course of a conversation. And at any given point, there'll be a topic under discussion, a question that's relevant. And using that, we can define really nicely what we mean by a non sequitur. And this is a quote from Craig Roberts. Non sequiturs are assertions which don't bear on the question under discussion. Where do you live? I love polygons. Aren't they beautiful shapes? It's a non sequitur, which is not relevant to the theory, to the question under discussion. It might even be informative, but it just reflects bad strategy and a lack of commitment to the goals of the conversation. The goal of the conversation between Galileo and Bob was not teach me all you know about astronomy, right? To explain heliocentricity to somebody who lives in the world of geocentricity wouldn't have been something that could be done just on one foot pretty quickly. And in a conversation about whether you woke up early or late, giving a lecture on astronomy just seems to be something of a non sequitur. What was Galileo to do? We can refine this, we can make this better. I'm not going to read these out, but I'll give you the example. These are examples of Stulnaker. Alice is speaking to Bob. Alice says to Bob, you see that guy over there drinking the martini? He's a philosopher. Bob happens to know that that guy over there isn't drinking a martini, he's drinking a Perrier in a cocktail glass. He could stop Alice and say, oh, by the way, that's a Perrier, not a martini. But it's just not relevant because their conversation is about philosophers and what people in the room do professionally. It would be a non sequitur. So what he does is he just accepts for the sake of the conversation that it's a martini, even though he doesn't even believe it. So now there's an item in the common background of the conversation that Bob doesn't really believe, but he's just accepting for the sake of the conversation because it's not necessary to correct her. Imagine for a moment that Alice happens to know also that it's just a Perrier in a cocktail glass. But he doesn't know that Bob knows that, and she can't be bothered to explain to him, you know that guy with the Perrier, don't think it's a martini, it really is just that just wouldn't be relevant. So she says that, thinking that but he also knows, but he doesn't know that so it doesn't matter. They're both accepting something that neither of them believe for the sake of having an easier conversation. And I think a lot of the time, we accept things that aren't true for the sake of conversation because there's a conflict of virtues. There's this cooperative principle. In a conversation, let's cooperate and get to the point quickly. And there's also the virtue of not misleading people. And sometimes Alice is being misleading if she's calling it a martini when she knows it's a Perrier. But it's not like a really nasty type of misleading. It was because she was trying to do something nice, which is cooperate in the conversation. Again, what was Galileo to do? We can't really blame him for not giving this guy Bob a lecture on astronomy in order to explain to him what he really thought about the sun, when all he was trying to say was, I thought you got up early this morning. Okay, so now we can summarise what I want to say. In order to facilitate communication, Galileo accepts a common background, naive physics, a physics he doesn't really believe in, that the fishmonger operated with in order not to have to give a lecture in astronomy. Perhaps Sarah is an atemporalist too, and she either was on LSD or she has taken a course in the metaphysics of time, but in order to facilitate communication, Sarah accepts a naive theology, a folk theology, where it's okay to talk about God acting in time, because most people operate with that type of theology when they talk about God, because she didn't want to have to give a lecture on the bus in philosophical theology. Knowing how conversations work, it would actually be unfair of us to infer from what Galileo said that he believed in geocentricity. That would just be a bad inference. Likewise, we'd be wrong to infer from what Sarah said that she really believes in divine temporality, that she really believes that God exists in time. Okay, I'm going to skip a little bit and get on to make-believe. Okay, because a question I have, a worry that I have left over, is okay, when we talk, we assume all sorts of stuff we don't believe for the sake of simplicity. We assume a simple science. I say that I came to London. According to Einstein's theory of relativity, it's just as perspicuous for me to say that London came to me, because all motion is relative, right? But that would be an unduly complicated way of speaking. So when I speak, in normal context, I just assume a more naive physics for the sake of ease. And I think we do that in theology too. One of my worries is, and this is what I want to explain now, and this is what I think has the more of the take-home value, is why is it that scientists are more easily aware of the fact that they're just assuming a naive physics? People in this room, I think, suffered a kind of attention. Yeah, we believe that God judges us on Rosh Hashona. Yeah, when you explain to me the debate, I'm an atemporalist. Do I know how I square that? I'm not so sure. The scientist knows that in conversation with normal people, they're assuming a more simple science in order to explain themselves. And there are other things too, which I think it would be easy. All Bob has to say to Galileo is, do you really believe the sun moves? Galileo was straight away, that will change the context of the conversation straight away. It will now be appropriate for Galileo to give an astronomy lesson. If Bob said, do you really believe the sun moves? Straight away the context shifts. But if I'm sitting with Sarah and she says, I believe God judges us on Rosh Hashana, I say, do you really believe God judges us on Rosh Hashana? She'll probably just say yes. It's going to be harder to shift her over to the more complicated theological commitments that she probably has buried deep down. Why is it harder? So Howard Wetstein, a lovely, smiley philosopher who is a Limud popular, he wants to say that when we say that somebody believes something religious, what we really mean when we're talking about religious beliefs is they sign on to an image. That's all we mean. When I say that Sarah believes that God judges us in Rosh Hashana, all I mean is Sarah signs on to the image that God judges us on Rosh Hashana. It means that's a metaphor or an image that motivates her, that she choreographs her life according to it, doesn't necessarily mean she really believes that's what goes on, but she acts as if it goes on, and she tries to view the world as if it goes on. It's an image for her. What I want to do is beef this up, because I think there are some problems, so I call this slide Wetstein Beefed Up. I don't think all religious beliefs can be like that. And I have a couple of reasons. First of all, why does she choose Jewish images over Christian images, over Muslim? If it's all just images, why choose one set of images over another? I think she needs to have some beliefs that justify why she's signed on to Jewish images rather than non-Jewish images. I also think that she needs beliefs in order to make some of these images powerful for her. For instance, if you were an atheist, a committed atheist, but you decide you're going to sign on to the imagery of Rosh Hashona, I don't think it's going to make you cry quite as hard when you say Unatona Toke as it does for the theist. So I think we do need to have beliefs in the background. But I have this view that I've spoken about a lot before. It talks about the role of make-belief in the religious life. And what I say is that it's rarely, if ever, appropriate for a religious person merely to believe in the teachings of their religion. I talk about make-believe as the attempt to experience the world as described by your make-believe. So, let's make believe for the moment that we're sitting on a rock that's travelling at 100,000 kilometres per hour around the sun. And that happens to be true. We are. We probably all believe that already, but let's try make-believing it. Make-believing it, I'm talking about, is the attempt to experience the world as if ... And the thing you fill in the ... might even be true. Let's try and experience the world as if it's a rock hurtling around space, which it is, but we don't always experience the world as if it is. Let's try and experience the world as if it is. It's a game. Let's play this game of make-believe. So I think even the things that you need to believe, you also need to make believe. And I have this beautiful quote from Rav Hirsch that I don't think I have time to read, in which he says that the commandment to believe in God is not, first and foremost, a cognitive commandment, you must believe in God. It's to believe that God is your God and to make him your God, such that every breath you draw feels as if it's a gift from... It is a gift from God, you believe that too. But it doesn't always feel as if every breath you draw is a gift. We don't experience the world as if it's true. And that's the mitzvah. The mitzvah is not just to believe in God, but also to make believe in him, in addition. And there are things which you only need to make believe, you don't need to believe. Right? Maimonides talks about, in the Laws of Repentance, he talks about how we're supposed to view the world as if it's equally balanced between sin and merit. Such that if you do the tiniest misdeed, you'll tip the cosmic balance over towards the side of misdeed, and there'll be an apocalypse right there and then. But if you do a mitzvah, you'll tip things the other way and you'll save the world. Some of the commentators on the Mishnah Torah said, but Maimonides, how can you tell us to view the world that way? It's not true. People sin, and the world doesn't end. Yeah, like as if Maimonides didn't understand that. Maimonides says, even though it's not true, make believe it's true. We say to our children every Seder night, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and the Lord our God took us out from there. And had we not been taken out, then we, our children, and our children's children would have remained slaves to Pharaoh. That's not true. Pharaoh doesn't exist anymore. Mubarak doesn't exist anymore. They change head of state so frequently that I can't keep track. And we're supposed to believe that had we not been freed from Egypt, we'd still be slaves to Pharaoh? As if the pharaonic institutions of power would have been the only ones from the distant ancient world that remain constant, and we'd still have it's just unbelievable. It's just not true. We don't really believe that. You could either say it's a metaphor, or you could tie it in with what comes later in the Haggadah, that in every generation a person is obliged to regard him or herself as if they had come out of Egypt personally. It's a game of make-believe. You're supposed to view yourself as if you were personally liberated. As if, had it not been for this story, you would still be a slave in Egypt. So I think Howie's right when we say that Sarah believes in P, and if P is a religious idea, Sarah believes that God judges her on Rosh Hashana, primarily what we mean is Sarah signs on to an image. She makes beliefs as a P. Some of those things she also believes, but not all of them. So, what I'm trying to say is, naive physics, we only assume for the sake of conversation to make things easier. Naive theology is much more important because we engage with naive theology. We make believe it to be true. Maimonides would say that once you know what a metaphor is a metaphor for, get rid of it, because now you know what it really means. Once you know that God isn't really writing names in books, get rid of it. Once you know it's a metaphor for, get rid of it. No. I'm saying something quite different. Part of what it means to be religious is to live inside that image, even though it's naive, even though you don't really believe it, even though your actual beliefs are much more sophisticated. So, whereas naive physics is just something we adopt for the sake of ease sometimes, because we can't be bothered to give a lecture in physics every time we speak about motion, so we assume a naive physics. Naive theology is a really important plank of religiosity. We should all be engaging with naive theology all the time. We might also have a sophisticated theology that explains why it's rational to engage with our naive theology, but our naive theology is really important to us. So that's why it's harder to get Sarah to shake it. All you have to do to Galileo is say, do you really believe the sun moves? And he'll straight away dump the naive physics and say, oh, you really want to know about my astronomy? Oh, I'll tell you. But you say to Sarah, you really believe that God judges us in Rosh Hashana? Yeah, that's why I'm going to pray in shul. You'd have to push her a bit harder. Yeah, but don't you know about God and time? And then, oh, if that's what you mean. Oh, yeah, I do have a more sophisticated belief set. I might not have worked it out exactly, but... And she's being rational. And she's not being misleading, because even Galileo wasn't being misleading, but she's also not being confused. Even if she doesn't understand exactly what it is she's doing, what she's not realizing is she might not know exactly how her sophisticated theology ties up or justifies her naive theology. That's not a problem. We're not all theologians. What's really important to religion is, are you good at making believe this stuff? Are you capable of standing there on Rosh Hashana and putting yourself into that place where you experience your life in the hands of God? That's what makes you good at being religious, right? Are you good at this stuff, this religion stuff? If you can do that, then you're good at it. For instance, most mathematicians are really bad at the philosophy of maths. If you ask them, what is a number? They might not have an answer to you. They're very good at using numbers, right? But if you ask them, what is a number? A lot of them, unless they do number theory, won't have a good answer. But that's fine. You can do maths without knowing much about the metaphysics of maths. You can also do religion without knowing much about the philosophy of religion and how it really works. But naive theology, what I'm saying, isn't something we should disparage. It's not something that we use just to explain. I once had this worry. My kid came home from school singing, Hashem is here, Hashem is there, Hashem is truly everywhere. And I was a slightly earlier stage in my philosophy, and I wanted to say, well, that's not true, because Hashem isn't spatio-temporally located. You should sing, Hashem's not here, Hashem's not there, Hashem's not really anywhere, not here, not there. He doesn't have a location in space and time. But I wasn't really, he was 3, right? Well, you know, and I thought, at the time I used to think, well, that's okay, it's just a pedagogic stage. No, it's not just a pedagogic stage. Your naive theology is part of religion that you should take into your adulthood with you, and you should really experience it. It was easier, I think, when we didn't know as much. You could rest assured in your naivety. Now, the real kind of conflict within modern orthodoxy is we sometimes know that our naive theology isn't true. And that forces us to do some much more sophisticated philosophy to explain how it can be rational to engage with your naive theology. But what I want to leave you with is, don't give up on the naive theology. Whatever your philosophy, however it is you end up justifying your religious practices, you believe that there was a revelation at Har Sinai, or you believe that the zeitgeist of the Jewish people has been divinely inspired and this mythology is... Whatever the beliefs are that justify your practice, don't give up on the naive stuff. Do sit there on Rosh Hashana and try at least to make believe whatever you happen to believe. that God is writing your name into one of the books. And please God, however the sophisticated theology actually works out, we should all merit to be written into the right books. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Okay, firstly, I'd like to thank Sam for the funky metaphysics. Secondly, let's just spare a thought for his little child there. And I know Sam is happy to take questions. And I'll tell you your
Only some questions.
Only some questions.
So, sort of two questions, but I'm getting away with one, which is this works in terms of practice and ritual. So, because essentially it's about what ritual does for you as a human being, and you don't even need theology for ritual at all. And if you have a sophisticated theology that doesn't match the ritual, the bridge is naive theology. But that's if you look at ritual. But if you're looking at theology, it doesn't really work. In other words, you can't have a belief in God if you don't believe in God.
Yeah.
You can't construct a naive belief in God because it helps you believe in God.
Yeah.
There has to be a bedrock somewhere.
Yeah. Look, part of what I was trying to do in that slide where I say Wetstein beefed up, it seems like I know and love Howie, and I read everything I can get my hands on of his, but it does seem to me like he doesn't think there needs to be a bedrock at all. That we can just make believe everything. He doesn't call it make believe; he calls it signing on. But we can just reduce all belief to engagement with imagery, and I don't think that works. And I think you're right; it doesn't work. There needs to be a bedrock of belief, and I think there are certain your belief that might justify orthodox practice might be different to my beliefs that justify orthodox practice, but there are going to be some beliefs that are essential to everybody. And I think belief in God, for instance, is going to be one of them. I don't think this makes sense without theism. However, part of your comment raises a really interesting kind of epicycle to this theory. The sophisticated theologian who adopts the kind of picture I'm talking about, where you use naive theology as a bridge to explain ritual, to adopt your terminology, it was a nice way of putting it. The sophisticated theologian needs to explain, why would God make a world in which you have to make believe stuff that isn't true in order to kind of relate to him, right? That's going to have to be part of your picture. I think that make-believe has the power, because I'm also an apophatic theologian. What that means is I think that there are at least certain things about God that are beyond the power of language to describe, right? God, there might be some things we can describe about God, but language is never going to do a fully complete description of God. Furthermore, I think that in our moments of religious experience, we're capable of experiencing God in a much more fine-grained way than we could ever hope to describe him. That's why we might come out of religious experience saying, I haven't a clue how to describe what it is I'm feeling. I felt something really quite fine-grained, but no words do it justice. I think making believe stuff sometimes helps you to have the experiences. It puts you in a kind of state of mind that makes you more open to experience something which I think is really real. But then I am doing what Pascal did. Pascal has his famous wager in which he says, basically, it's worth it to be a theist. Because if atheism is true, and you're a theist, then if you're wrong, so what, you're wrong, you die, and that's it. But if theism is true and you're an atheist, you're really in trouble, because if you were wrong, you're going to have an eternity of damnation or whatever. So be a theist. But the problem is, even if you're convinced with the wager, how can you just start believing in something because you've been convinced it would be prudent? You can't just believe stuff. Like you need to feel convinced before you can believe stuff. And Pascal said, just go to church and pray. Act as if you believe, and eventually the belief will come. And sometimes I think that's really stupid. And sometimes I think it's really profound. I have religious experience of an incoherent form. And then there are times in my life where I can feel like I'm in complete theological darkness. But I carry on praying and I carry on acting as if. And it does come back. So just to conclude my answer to you, yes, I think there needs to be a fundamental ground of belief. And even if you're not capable of a really sophisticated theology, you need to know that you really believe in God. Your theism isn't just some... I think that's really important. Secondly, I do think maybe if you're in conflict with that point, maybe if you're not yet a theist, sincere engagement with the make-belief as an attempt to come to believe might be a useful practice.
It's sort of like a loop. You can begin with a very basic theistic belief.
Yeah.
You make believe.
Yeah.
Make believe helps you live a good life.
Yeah.
But make believe might also set you back.
Help you to experience more.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right. Something like that.
Lovely. Thank you. Stefan.
Thank you very much for this talk being here.
Yes, I didn't really want you to ask a question because you really are a linguist. So go on, though.
I just wondered when Sarah signs onto this image.
Yeah.
And I think I would be an atemporalist when it comes to Sarah signing onto that image. I don't think she decided to sign onto that. And my point is the following. I don't think her theology is naive. Because I think when she thinks God is judging her on Rosh Hashana, it is not necessarily a metaphor or not an image, or rather, it is what Lakoff and Johnson call a conceptual metaphor. And their example, discussion is war. You attack arguments, you defend a position. You don't do as if you were attacking an argument.
Yeah.
You don't do as if you were defending a thesis. If you are engaging in a discussion, you have no choice. Your vocabulary and your concepts are those of the war. And it is not that sort of metaphor that could be reduced, just like those about the sun. Those conceptual metaphors cannot be reduced, but they're not necessarily naive.
This is a great question. I'm receiving much better questions here than I have in universities. What Stefan's talking about is there are these thinkers, Lakoff and Johnson, who've done a lot of work on the nature of metaphor, and they argue that metaphor saturates all of our language use, even in places where we're really not aware of them. We're just always speaking metaphorically without sometimes being aware. And these conceptual metaphors are, we generally think of things in terms of other things. So we think of a debate, the example that Stefan gave, in terms of a war. Oh, he didn't defend himself very well. Oh, he held his position. And it's not that we're making believe in a thing. It's thinking of things in terms of other things. That's just how people think. So, first of all, I want to say I don't really subscribe to Lakoff and Johnson. I don't think they're able to make a really neat distinction between metaphorical talk and non-metaphorical talk. And I think there is such a distinction. For them, it becomes hazy if non-existent. But moreover, I think I can repackage my insight in a way that might please you as follows. Epistemologists, those are the people who study the nature of belief, they make a distinction between dispositional beliefs and occurrent beliefs. So a dispositional belief is something you believe, but you're not really thinking about the fact you believe it, you just believe it. There are loads of things you believe right now, like Tokyo is the capital of Japan. You all believe that, but you weren't thinking of it until I reminded you of it. But it wasn't that you didn't believe it until I reminded you of it, you believed it dispositionally. Your belief that I'm speaking is probably occurrent, right? It's right there at the front of your mind. You're believing it in a much more active way. I think my point was that distinctively religious beliefs, I distinguish in my work between religiosity and Frömmkeit. And what I mean by that is Frömmkeit is just belonging to the Frum group. It's a sociological label. Whereas religiosity is something much more profound, but often much more fleeting. The sincerely Frum person tries to be religious from time to time, right? It tries to attain moments of religiosity. And I think that the moments of religiosity are where purely dispositional beliefs become occurrent. So if you want to dump everything I said, because you don't think that Galileo's talking about the sun, you think it was a conceptual metaphor that you can't be reduced, it's all metaphor, we always speak metaphor, ... which I don't think, because I think, for instance, now, when we speak about the sun rising, it's clearly a metaphor. It's become a conventional metaphor. But back then it wasn't a metaphor to the people he was speaking to. If you believed in geocentricity and you spoke about the sun rising, you meant the sun moved. And I don't think it was a conceptual metaphor, I don't think, okay. But if you want to dump all of that, this is what I'd still like you to take home, which is this. It's one thing to believe dispositionally that God judges you on Rosh Hashona. It's another thing to make that belief a current. And the way to make it a current, I think, is to make believe in it. Because what it means to succeed in having a belief currently is to be experiencing the world right now as if it's true. And what it means to make believe in something is to try to experience the world right now as if what you're making believe is true. So if you want to dump all of the stuff I said about Galileo and Sarah, how to interpret her, say Sarah's not engaging in signing on to an image, this metaphor of God judging us, it's irreducible, it's not naive, it's as sophisticated as it can be. And basically dumping everything I said, and I'd urge you not to, because what I said was true and right and decent and good. But if you do want to dump all of that, that's still what I'd like you to take home. That it's one thing to believe that God judges you on Rosh Hashona, it's another thing to believe it. And what we need to do is engage in make-believe in order to transform our dispositional beliefs into current ones. But like I said, that would be a shame to only take that home, when I said much more.
I'm going to take one last question.
Thanks very much.
Pleasure.
Speak up, please.
It seems to me that the paradox, as you constructed it, arose from the potential confusion that God is judging us in Rosh Hashanah.
Yeah.
And wondering whether we shouldn't tackle the confusion on the temporalism side instead. Why not look back historically and say, until Aristotelianism entered Jewish theology, nobody believed in temporalism.
That's right.
And then think whether we can't construct a Jewish theology that is not Aristotelian, that's experiential.
Yeah, okay, I'll give a quick answer.
That thinks when God is in the sentence, God judges in Rosh Hashanah, we're speaking about the God in experience, in time and in space, and we don't care about the unbeliever who has no religiosity, no significance for religiosity. So, if we don't do that, then we have to start distinguishing between naive belief and then philosophical belief.
Okay, I think I got you.
Why not?
Okay,
contribute something to the philosophical tradition by
a lot of theologians these days, especially philosophical theologians in philosophy departments, are attracted by that move. The move is to say, look, medieval Jewish philosophy, with all this unmoved mover, God outside of time, perfect being theology, it took us so far away from the God of the Bible, who changes his mind, who gets angry, who seems to have certain imperfections, things he doesn't know, and etc., etc. And the God of the rabbis, God is clearly in time, God lives with us, God suffers. And my response, I need to be quick, would be twofold. First of all, I think even if you want to go down that road, then you're right. Like, if you want to take temporalism, then there's no confusion in what Sarah said. She just shouldn't be an atemporalist. Atemporalism is wrong. It's inconsistent with Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah encodes temporalist beliefs. Temporalism is right. Go with it. And there's going to be no distinction now between naivety and sophistication, because the naivety is true. What I was calling naive is just true. God is in time. However, I think conflicts of the same structure will still arise. I don't think anyone is going to accept that God has a body, is corporeal. Even if the rabbis of old did. There are certain things of the Aristotelian picture I don't think we're going to want to shake, and it's still going to lead sometimes to conflicts between what seems to be naive and what seems to be sophisticated. And furthermore, and I'll speak about this more when on Monday night, so come on Monday night, I really hope to see you all there. I think the way that Jewish theology evolves, I have certain commitments that seem to be completely irrational, but my commitments bring in a notion of the unraveling revelation of God to the Jewish people. So for me, it's impermissible to wipe out any generation of Jewish thought and say, no, we're just going to skip them. You're right. Maimonides, Crescus, Gershonides introduced foreign ideas into Judaism, but they're there now. The thing is, can we build a super sophisticated theology that's able to really reconcile the theology of the rabbis, I mean the early rabbis, the Talmud, the Midrash, the theology of the Hebrew Bible, with the theology of Maimonides, and with the philosophy of Bertrand Russell. And because he was also part of the tradition, he's just a lesser known member of the Masorah. And my answer is yes, I think we can. But I see the attraction of what you want to do, because there's a certain purity to that. You want to go back to the God that the rabbis believed in. But why not go further back? Why not go back to the pre-Second Temple God? Or why not go back to the pre-biblical God of the Canaanite? We're an evolving tradition. I'm trying to kind of give justice to each level of the strata. Do some justice, actually, by criminally misappropriating them all to create a fruit salad in which they can sit side by side. But at least I'm trying to do something with all of them, yeah.
I'd like to thank Sam for his criminal misappropriations, and before all our brains completely explode, we will take a...
That was really hard, wasn't it? I'm sorry, thank you for bearing with me. The others would be a bit easier, so thank you.
I really want to thank Sam, because he makes us think about things that we don't think about. And there are not many people around who do that with such grace and such eloquence and such generosity. So a huge thank you to Sam.